G'day mate, 40 here. What is it about motorcyclists who feel so entitled to just blast their music, right, out of their motorcycles on speakers as they go down busy streets or empty streets? Incredibly obnoxious. When I was a kid, we were respectful of the music we would blast. So I was watching a panel discussion hosted at the Harvard Kennedy School of Public Administration. It had Dan Balls, like the 70-something Washington Post reporter, and some black guy from Axios, and a woman reporter from the Washington Post. And the upshot of what they had to say in the first 20 minutes that I listened was that it was America that failed Kamala Harris. That America was just too sexist and racist to appreciate, her sterling qualities. In reality, Kamala Harris was a giant nullity. You only got to where she was as an affirmative action hire. She possessed none of the requisite skills that you'd expect in a president. She was completely implausible as a candidate for president of the United States. She was only in her position thanks to affirmative action, thanks to Joe Biden fulfilling his party's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so he promised that he'd appoint a black woman as his vice president, and she was the best of the lot, which isn't saying much. And then she underperformed as vice president and was indecisive on the campaign trail, couldn't explain her radical change in politics from when she was running in 2019 to the present day. But it's America's at fault that America just wasn't ready for a female president, that America just wasn't ready for a black female president. See a lot of rage on the part of liberal pundits, particularly black women, who are arguing, oh man, white women failed us by voting for Donald Trump. Latino men, they're so chauvinist and racist and misogynistic and retrograde and regressive and reactionary. It's Latino men who failed us, and white women, and even black men who knew they could be so chauvinist and misogynist. And all these panelists at the Kennedy School at Harvard, all treating racism and sexism as something that is morally real and as a valid explanatory mechanism for understanding the election returns. So instead of dealing with reality, they live in their delusional bubble that there's any such thing as racism, sexism, homophobia, and the like. And honest reactions, right, they will just dismiss as sexist, racist, and the like. And that way they just can ignore painful reality that the people just not good enough. It's the people who failed. The people are so retrograde, so uneducated, so bigoted. On the other hand, it's interesting how real Democratic politicians are wrestling with the implications of this Trump victory. People like Richie Torres. And so you have mainstream Democratic politicians who are saying some sensible things in reaction to Donald Trump's stunning sweep of the battleground states and victory in the popular vote. On the other hand, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has been silent. And the liberal pundits are engaging in no introspection. They're just riding their high horse of moral superiority, preaching down to the rest of us that we failed Kamala Harris and the progressive mission, right? No introspection on how their one-sided, distorted, manipulated, unfair coverage of Donald Trump infuriated people and actually drove them towards voting for Donald Trump. So you have real Democratic politicians, particularly in the House of Representatives, who are engaged in introspection. But those in the paid pundit class, I'm not seeing any introspection by those on the left. And so more and more people will get their news and opinion and punditry from alternative sources, recognizing how stacked and manipulated the game is as practiced by the elite news media. So people will turn to podcasts. Just that smug condescension on the part of all these panelists at Harvard. Oof. Oh, then I listened to Matter of Opinion podcast, and speaking of smug condescension, I mean, nobody does it more than Lydia Polgreen. I will admire her high sense of self-esteem. So even though much of what she has to say is idiotic, it doesn't hold her back from making the most sweeping condemnations of Americans who have a different hero system from her. Right? She's just the absolute worst. I really enjoyed how she lectured Ross Douthat in the latest episode that Michelle are out there reporting on the ground. Yeah, through their very narrow partisan blinkers. Well, Michelle Cottle does some interesting work. But Lydia Polgreen's explanation for why the Democrats lost, apparently the Democrats are just honest. They're just too honest. And Donald Trump lies all the time, and he's able to get away with it. And so that's the reason the Democrats lost. And then Michelle Cottle said, well, the reason the Democrats lost is that they're too rational. So two liberal pundits, and their explanation for why the Democrats lost this election is that Democrats are just too darn honest and too darn rational. There's some real deep introspection on the part of the liberal punditry. Oh, and it's stunning to witness the White House and Kamala Harris and Joe Biden sweeping change in tone regarding Donald Trump. Remember, this guy is a fascist and a threat to democracy. And this is supposed to be the last election we'll ever have now that we voted in Donald Trump. And they've completely abandoned that line of rhetoric. So after weeks and months of calling Donald Trump a threat to democracy, they've abandoned it, which just makes you think it was fraudulent all along. So you can't take people literally. Often when people say exaggerated things such as Trump is Hitler, Trump is a fascist, Trump is a threat to democracy, they're just trying to say he's a bad guy, I don't like him. And then they will just manufacture reasons for why they don't like him. But that the White House can just completely shift its tone to conciliatory. We're going to work together. Like, why, if Donald Trump is Hitler, if Donald Trump is a fascist, if Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, why would you work with him on the transition? Right? Why would you invite him back to the White House? Why would you cooperate? Why would you abandon all your rhetoric about Donald Trump as a threat to democracy? Why the big change now, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris? I can't imagine that Kamala will have any future in politics. I mean, what a giant, empty vessel. What a terrible candidate. I mean, she embodies the downsides of affirmative action. My God. So I'm excited about Susie Wiles. I mean, this was Donald Trump's pick to be his chief of staff, and it is receiving universal praise. Right? Republicans across the Republican spectrum are thrilled that Susie Wiles will be chief of staff. She's one of the few people who has Donald Trump's respect, one of the few people that Donald Trump listens to. One of the few people who seems to be able to manage Donald Trump. And then even her political opponents have a lot of respect for Susie Wiles. Like when you treat people with respect, they tend to treat you with respect back, and Susie Wiles treats people with respect. And she's calm, clear-headed, organized. And the more people that Donald Trump can roll out for his cabinet and for important positions in his administration, right, the more he will dominate the news cycle, right, the more he will squeeze out competing stories. And likely many of the stories will be positive because journalists will be wanting to get scoops. And so there's something in journalism called the beat sweetener, right? That's where you write nice things initially about the people you're covering so that you can get access to them and to their stuff. And then when you get access, right, then you can get more devastating stuff and you can knife them in the back later on. But initially, right, when Donald Trump starts nominating people for his new administration, right, there are going to be a lot of positive stories written because journalists are hoping for scoops. And so they talked about it on Mark Halperin show this morning, how journalists are calling out the Trump campaign after being viciously unfair to the Trump campaign for weeks. Now they're saying, hey, love to get lunch with Susie Wiles and Donald Trump and love to get some scoops. But maybe the Trump administration will be a little wiser and smarter with how it deals with the press this time around. It's sad how pathetic Donald Trump's need is for positive coverage or any kind of coverage in the New York Times. Like, he doesn't really care about the Trump-friendly outlets that praise him. He primarily cares about what the New York Times has to say about him, and the New York Times is relentlessly hostile. It's like there have been times in my life where I just keep going back to a woman who has contempt for me and treats me badly. And yet I'm fixated on this woman who is contemptuous of me. And Donald Trump is fixated on the New York Times, even though they repeatedly treat him badly. And maybe there was something to that liberal pundit who says that Democrats are too rational, because Donald Trump is an emotional guy, right? He's much more emotionally naked and transparent. And he makes a lot more decisions that are obviously emotional. Now, the Democrats may sound more rational, but often people will transmute their raw emotions into things that sound rational. While Donald Trump doesn't use such stilted, convoluted, elevated, educated university speak. Right? He's much more raw in how he says things. So he's less afraid to be naked in his emotions. They did the same thing with Kavanaugh. As soon as he was appointed, they abandoned claims of rape against him. Yeah. And the liberal pundits are still talking about how Donald Trump won on a campaign of white resentment, right? Donald Trump has secured a lower percentage of the white vote in each of his 3 presidential elections. But supposedly he's operating campaigns primarily based on white resentment. I think Donald Trump effectively tapped into the resentment of the working class against elites. And sometimes some degree of resentment serves you, right? It's not an ideal to be entirely free of resentment. Right? You have to live in the real world. And if you're entirely free of resentment, you might not have the energy to get the things done that you need to accomplish. And so if you have any kind of in-group identity, there's going to be a resentment that accompanies that in-group identity. Right? You don't have a high in-group Jewish identity, black identity, Christian identity without having resentment against many out-groups. Right? Resentment and in-group identity just run hand in hand. It's not something that's unique to white people or to Trump supporters. It's a universal part of the human condition. The news is incredibly naive and one-sided in regard to these elementary facts about the human condition. Right? For just as many black people resent white people as white people resent black people, Jews, Christians, right? Every strong in-group identity has reasons to feel resentment against out-groups. Incredibly calm. I think that Trump winning the popular vote removed a self-righteous argument that the Democrats were going to use, that, oh, we still have the will of the people, it's just that we're dealing with a rigged system. And so I think that Trump's, the breadth of his victory has muted reaction. And it's striking how the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, right, still remains pretty silent. Oh, there's a great post on X about threat to democracy, replace democracy with bureaucracy. It's a bit like threat to our democracy. What is our democracy? It's those parts of the political system that we like and that we can control. And the federal workforce donates to the Democrats by a margin of 20-1 vis-a-vis Republicans. And so no wonder that the Trump administration wants the ability to replace the top 50,000 bureaucrats. Now, I am not so naive that I think, oh, that's just going to be awesome, that there are no downsides to this. Right? I have great concern about competence. Right? There are many occasions where it's far more important to have competent people running our government than Trump loyalists. And there is a callous disregard and carelessness, ignorance, sloppiness, and contempt exhibited by Republicans, whether MAGA Republicans or traditional Republicans, towards the civil service and towards government. Government does a lot of essential things. It's not that everything that the government touches is inept. Right? We rely on the government. We have, compared to other countries, a relatively effective government in some areas, more effective than other countries in some areas, less effective in other areas. But overall, we do need government for many essential services, and any broad, sweeping prejudice that if the government does it, it's going to be crap, it's going to be inept, is it's going to be better off if we replace it with the private sector is not necessarily true. Right? There are plenty of things that are corrupt and inept done by the private sector, and there's plenty of excellence in the government sector. And so I hope that Donald Trump's administration does not repeat many of its errors from the first term, where they often prioritized loyalty over competence, and they had ignorance about the functions of government and just a willing disregard for the reality of the importance of many departments of the government, as illustrated by the great Michael Lewis book, The Fifth Risk, about the careless way that the Trump administration dealt with vast sectors of the U.S. government. We need to do more to honor our effective and excellent civil servants. So I noticed that the White House press secretary did not like being question by Jackie Heinrich of Fox News about why the dramatic shift by the Biden administration with regard to Donald Trump as a fascist and a threat to democracy. Right? That message has just gone completely away. Just as when Kamala Harris took over, that message went away and was replaced with the joy vibe. And then the message that Republicans are weird. Not so much a threat to democracy or fascist or Hitler, it's just weird. And then Kamala and the Democrats just kept moving through different messages while the Trump campaign stayed on message that we are threatened by inflation, by lack of control at the border, by trade policy that doesn't favor American workers, and by endless wars abroad. And so another popular talking point by liberal pundits is that Donald Trump's policies are not popular. Right? That's absurd. Right? Trump's policy to close the border is popular. Donald Trump's policy to deport illegal aliens is popular. And the Biden administration policy of forgiving student loans, right, for doctors and dentists and lawyers, right, these loan forgiveness executive actions by the Biden administration, who's paying for that? Plumbers and working class Americans are having to pay taxes so that professional Americans with fancy degrees don't have to take responsibility for the debts that they willingly, knowingly took on. Just incredibly obnoxious. Right? People who did the responsible thing and paid down their student loans, right? They get gobsmacked while they stand there and see Biden intent on waiving loans for people who are less responsible. Right? We need government policy that rewards people doing the responsible pro-social things and punishes people for doing stupid, irresponsible, antisocial things. And that people who work with their hands should be footing the bills for Americans with fancy college degrees who irresponsibly haven't paid them off is incredibly obnoxious. So absolutely no soul searching by the mainstream media right now. Like if I'm missing some soul searching by the elite mainstream media, please point that out. I haven't noticed any. I'm not even pretending to introspect about how they got this so wrong. Now, we're seeing shifts in industrial policy in reaction to Donald Trump's threats to impose tariffs, right? Donald Trump got tough with China. He was the first American administration that got tough with China. And as a result, American industry has substantially shifted its manufacturing out of China. And that trend is only going to accelerate. We've had a massive amount of reshoring of manufacturing jobs back to the United States, in part due to policies taken up by the first Trump administration, then continued by the Biden administration. And Trump is going to use the threat of tariffs to, I would suspect, secure better trade deals for America. Right? Often the threat of tariffs will be quite substantial. People live their lives forward. And so if they think that if they manufacture in China, right, they're going to have to pay huge tariffs, right? Even if this is just in the theoretical stage right now, it's just words right now. But people whose living depends upon making smart decisions, right, they are already starting to shift more and more out of China in reaction to Donald Trump's threats to impose 60% tariffs on all goods manufactured in China. I think Americans would have a problem voting for female president, but Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris are two lousy politicians. Like, Hillary Clinton was not likable. Now, she was competent. She would have been ready to be president of the United States. Kamala Harris has not shown the competence that Hillary Clinton has. So Hillary Clinton and Kamala are both unlikable. Hillary certainly appeared competent, while Kamala has not. It is much more fun reading the news these days. And I primarily get my news from reading mainstream news sources, right? LA Times, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Sydney Morning Herald, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, New York Magazine, Axios, Politico. Right, those are my primary sources of news. And then about once a day or once every other day, I'll check out Substack. Steve Saylor's been incredibly quiet lately. He said almost nothing about the Trump victory. Keep expecting to wake up, check my email, and see that Steve Saylor has blogged, but he hasn't. He's been quite light on the blogging past 6 weeks, 2 months. I'm a fully paid up subscriber to Steve Saylor's Substack. Now, what's going on in Israel touches on themes that are also applicable for Donald Trump and the deep state. So, Bibi Netanyahu had as his foreign minister someone who was his political opponent, right? Someone who was leaking against him and doing everything he could to discredit Bibi Netanyahu. And just imagine what that was like to work with someone like that. And Bibi Netanyahu has a problem with the Israeli Defense Force and the security apparatus. They didn't wake him up on the evening of October 6th last year when it became increasingly obvious that Hamas was planning to attack. And so the Israeli Defense Force has continually been trying to embarrass and undercut Bibi Netanyahu. And there's a good case to be made for having a civilian run the Israeli Defense Force. Because the Israeli Defense Force wants to impose its own politics on the elected government of Israel. And so now Bibi has got rid of the most popular member of his cabinet, but who was actively engaged in a campaign to discredit him and had much of the deep state on his side. So Bibi Netanyahu has kept winning elections, but most of Israel's elite have been opposed to Bibi Netanyahu and wanting to humiliate Netanyahu for about 30 years now. And at various times, the elite rejoiced. I mean, back when Bibi lost an election, I think around 1999, Israel's elite rejoiced that this is the last they'd ever have to see of Bibi Netanyahu. Just like many liberal Americans rejoiced in 2020, this is the last we'll ever have to see of Donald Trump. He's completely finished. Trump comes back, Bibi comes back. Trump is at war with much of the elite, much of the deep state, and same with Bibi Netanyahu. And so on the day that Trump's elected, Bibi fires his defense minister to give himself a freer hand, because it must be incredibly difficult working with someone who's trying to sabotage you. And Donald Trump had that experience for 4 years, where much of the civil and even members of his own cabinet, his own team, were actively working to undermine him with the assistance of the news media. And the situation is mirrored, right, in Israel, in the United States. Trump and Bibi Netanyahu fell out for a time, but they're united by their common enemies in the deep state and their common struggles. Now, it's unpredictable how Trump's going to handle the Middle East, but I expect he'll give Bibi a freer hand, and the Trump administration certainly will be far more hostile to Iran. So the Biden administration continued Barack Obama's policy of trying to accommodate Iran. and try to buy them off, just as it forced Israel to give all sorts of undersea natural gas rights effectively to Hezbollah, to try to buy off Hezbollah from attacking Israel and allowing billions of Iranian money that had been frozen by the United States to flow back to Iran, and then it was turned into supporting anti-Israel such as Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, while Trump is going to favor a much more hostile policy to Iran unless Iran changes its ways. And I'm not saying either approach to Iran is superior. I don't know enough. It could be that staying in the JCPOA and that nuclear deal with Iran would have been a better policy. Could be that allowing Iran to get its billions back might be better policy. My suspicions are that the Trump policy is smarter. Stephen Walt wrote an essay in Foreign Policy magazine this week about 10 implications of Donald Trump's victory. And first implication is nobody knows anything about American politics. It's a mystery. Like, even the Trump team must have been surprised by their victory. And that's one of the dumb media tropes that you hear everywhere. In reality, the private polling showed for a year that Donald Trump was headed for a substantial electoral college victory. So it's not that nobody knew anything, right? Smart people who spent the money, did the work, and hired the right people, did know the sentiments in the swing states. They knew that Donald Trump was ahead there, and even Harris's good debate performance against Trump didn't switch any voters to Kamala. Right? She successfully baited Donald Trump, but she didn't make an effective case for herself. Political campaigns don't matter that much. Right? That would have been a much smarter thing Stephen Walt could have written, instead of nobody knows anything and I'm sure Trump's team is just as surprised as the rest of us by a sweeping victory. That's nonsense. Right? Trump's team was increasingly confident, and nobody in the Democratic political operation was confident of a Kamala victory. So Mar-a-Lago was confident that what happened on Tuesday night was exactly what was going to happen, and they were confident of that outcome for a year prior to it occurring. So a smarter analysis would have been campaigns don't usually change much. Facts on the ground were predisposed to an anti-incumbent surge throughout first world democracies, including the United States. And if there had never been a political campaign, right, Donald Trump still would have won. So Stephen Walt's a realist, but it's funny, a realist in foreign policy lingo is an approach to foreign policy that emphasizes relative balance of power and does not accord much weight to democracy and human rights and soft power, but instead just sees things in terms of raw power. But almost all liberal theoreticians in foreign policy are liberal left. Right? Almost none of them are Republican, including Stephen Walt, who's quite left-wing. John Mearsheimer, another famous realist, was a Bernie Sanders supporter. So Stephen Walt is a good Harvard member of the elite, is quite confident that the Donald Trump second term will not be as effective as his first term, that America will be poorer and more divided as a result. Stephen Walt sees Biden's policy in Ukraine as an absolute disaster. But there are a lot of things that I appreciate about Stephen Walt. All right, he's on the left, but I still appreciate a lot of his analysis. I like how he wrote in this essay, as a result of Trump's victory, Europe is screwed, right? They're going to have to largely fend for themselves, right? NATO might keep going in name, but it's not going to be one of Trump's top priorities, right? He's going to have a much more disdainful attitude towards NATO as compared to Joe Biden. And Europe is screwed, but Ukraine is really, really screwed. they're going to have to give Russia a substantial part of their territory because Ukraine made a massive mistake siding with the West against their immediate superpower neighbor, Russia, and you can't do that. Facts on the ground are that small countries next to superpowers do not get their own independent foreign policy. Right? You don't get your own independence if you're married with kids. If you're an employee, you're effectively a slave 40 hours a week. Right? You don't get to independently choose what you should be doing and how you should be doing it, usually when you're an employee. And when you're married and you have kids and you're embedded in a community or an extended family or strongly identifying in-group, right? You have to surrender a tremendous amount of autonomy. And so too, if you live next to China, Russia, or the United States, you don't get to have your own independent foreign policy. No way, Jose. It's having more people on your side, man. Okay, what about the next coming 4 years? Will he leave at the end of term or threaten to stay in power? I don't believe he's going to want to stay in power. He'll be 82 years of age. And so, yeah, I expect he will leave at the end of 4 years. Now, events will determine the success of the Trump presidency. Right? He has certain strengths that will enable him to thrive in certain contexts, but with other challenges, he's less suited to succeed. So events, my dear boy, events. That is what will determine the success of the Trump presidency. Okay, I'll talk to you folks later. Bye-bye.